in some cases, you point out why certain kinds of predictive models are so bad. Data leakage is an example, and we can talk about that. But I would think that over time, as people like you point out what the deficiencies are, these things would get better. Hi, Arvind.
Hi, Bob.
How you doing?
I'm doing well. How are you? I really look forward to chatting.
So do I, very much so. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright, publisher of the Nonzero newsletter. This is a Nonzero podcast. You are Arvind Narayanan, a professor of computer science at Princeton, also director of Center for Information Technology Policy there. And also you have your own newsletter called AI Snake Oil.
That's right.
I think you and I probably agree that people should subscribe to both of our newsletters, right?
I very much agree with that.
Yeah, even though you've never seen mine. Be careful. You never know what you're endorsing. Okay, so you also have a book called AI Snake Oil, same name, co-authored with Sayash Kapoor. I hope that's close to the pronunciation. The subtitle is What Artificial Intelligence Can Do, What It Can't, and How to Tell the Difference. And that's what we're going to talk about. I'm really looking forward to this. Your book does a good job of conveying the breadth of the field of AI, because what's gotten the most attention over the last couple of years, at least at the public level, is generative AI, AI that generates images, videos, and of course, language, as with Chat GPT. And one thing you emphasize in the book is that the field's a lot bigger than that. You do talk a fair amount about generative AI, and we're gonna talk about that. But you also have done a lot of work on the implications of predictive AI, which is used to do things like predict which prisoners, if released, are most likely to commit crimes, which patients are most likely to have a given problem or maybe cost an insurance company the most, which students are most likely to do well if admitted to some school. In principle, these are the kinds of things predictive AI can do. And then there are a couple of kinds of AI that don't obviously belong in one group or the other, although technically they may. I mean, there's facial recognition, which you talk about, and there are the algorithms that govern social media, which you talk about. So there's plenty to talk about. I want to actually start by asking you about a kind of a preliminary taxonomy I have for like people in the AI discourse, like people who have an opinion about AI. It seems to me there's at least three kinds of people, and I'm going to make a guess as to which kind you are. Okay. So there's first of all, it's kind of, famously there's kinds of doomers, including in the extreme case, kind of sci-fi doomers like Eliezer Yudkowsky, who worry about a superintelligence taking over the planet. Then there's kind of less dramatic doomers who just think the social consequences of generative AI, especially, and agentic AI, which we'll get into, could be pretty horrific, even if they don't go quite sci-fi. And at the other end of that spectrum, you've got, techno-optimists, in the extreme case, accelerationists, who are just kind of, don't worry, be happy. We don't need much regulation or a lot of worry. It'll all be fine. And then there's a group, and I think you kind of belong in this group, called the AI ethics group. And first tell me if I'm right, that you're kind of in that group. And if I am, well, whether I am or not, do you want to tell us what it means? Because I think you recognize the label.
I do. And I'd like to think I'm an AI pragmatist. So if I were to summarize in a couple of sentences my view of AI, I would say it's normal technology. It's not utopian. It's not dystopian. It's kind of like the internet. It is an important technology. It's going to become more important in our lives. It makes us perhaps work more productively. It's also going to have risks, just like the internet had risks. And so guardrails are needed. Regulation is needed. It's not full speed forward. But more importantly, I think societal adaptation is going to be needed, just like we're kind of still adapting to the internet. I think we're going to be adapting to AI for a long time. And that's probably the number one reason we wrote our book, which is to help people with this adaptation process. And yes, I got my start in the AI ethics community. In some sense, I am still a part of that community. But I think, I think the kind of the different camps that have emerged in AI, I think, have really helped no one. So I try to not, slot myself into any one particular set of beliefs. I think there are a lot of things on which I agree with the majority of people in the AI ethics community. There are some things with which I disagree as well.
Well, maybe this question will get at something you either disagree or agree with them on. There's one way I would distinguish the AI ethics people from the kind of, moderate and extreme doomers. Like, I would say both groups have a lot of criticisms of the industry. I mean, especially the commercial part of AI. But the doomers tend to emphasize the awesome power of AI, and the people in AI ethics tend to minimize the power of AI. I had Gary Marcus on the podcast, and I think of him as kind of in the AI ethics community. And I said, you remind me of the old joke about the person who says, the food at this place is so bad, at this restaurant is so bad, and the portions are so small. It's like if AI is really so far from impressive as Gary sometimes makes it sound, why should we be so worried about it? Do you kind of get the paradox I was talking about?
Definitely, yeah. Again, there are people with a broad spectrum of views here, and again, here I would take a middle ground. So I'm not as unimpressed by AI as Gary is. I think I was comparing it to the internet a minute ago, and the internet again is not a utopian or a dystopian technology, but it is something that was pretty transformational in our lives, and I think. It deserves to be AI deserves to be taken seriously for that reason, without panic and without undue hopes. But at the same time, I'm not quite sure. I agree with people who say this is close to useless. It's all a bubble. It's going to burst. I can't predict the future. It might. There might be a reckoning in terms of the investment into AI, but I can tell you just speaking for myself as a programmer, the way it's been completely transformative to how typical programmers go about the business of computer programming. It is, that alone for me is very impressive.
And that's an offshoot of the large language model research, right? Those things turned out to be good at not just finishing sentences of language, but finishing lines of computer code. And once people realized that, they kind of refined them for that purpose. And so programmers are relying on that very heavily, right?
That's right. That's right. Programmers are relying heavily on it. And there are certainly some areas where generative AI has had a very clear impact, language translation, for instance. But at the same time, there are many overhyped areas. The idea that we're all going to be using, AI assistants to order our food or buy flight tickets. There are a lot of companies that are working on this. OpenAI is reputed to be working on this. My research team is doing a lot of research on this. Yeah, but especially as a result of that research, we think that people really underestimate how tricky this problem is. That's both AI companies themselves and influencers, if you will, who are talking up what AI is going to be able to do in a few months. I think getting it to do these messy things that require a lot of common sense and interacting with real world entities. I think that's going to turn out to be harder than expected.
So this is the so-called agentic AI. In other words, AI that doesn't just talk to you or create pictures, but does stuff for you. And in some of the more the doom scenarios, but also some of the very optimistic sci-fi scenarios, there's no limit to what it can do. They wind up being CEOs of corporations. But you're saying that it's actually going to be harder than we think to even get one that will do a good job of making my plane reservations in any way other than the most obvious thing. Like if I say, get the earliest flight out of Newark on Saturday, yeah, I can do that presumably. But you're saying if you get much more complicated than that, it's going to be hard?
Oh, no. Even get the earliest flight out of Newark or whatever is very, very hard. And it's not about, so the way you phrase that is very interesting. You're thinking about the parts of it that are hard for people, right? So that's not necessarily the parts that are hard for AI. Moving the mouse to the right part of the screen, that's an incredibly difficult problem for AI, right? And that's the part that is very easy to miss here. And this goes back to the same experience that AI researchers had, 50 years ago when developing chess playing AI. They started with chess because they figured, that's the hardest problem. So if we crack that, we've cracked everything else. Let's take a swing at the hardest thing. And it turned out that making a chess playing AI to beat grandmasters was very easy. Just make it calculate a lot. But literally making a robot to move chess pieces physically turned out to be much, much, much harder. And I think we're finding the same thing again here. And here's another way to put it, if I may. So the reason chatbots are so good is that they have been trained on literally on the order of 10 trillion words online. And now, if you want agentic AI to do things in the real world, you can't just take chatbots and ask them to do stuff. You can start from that foundation, but then you have to ask this agentic AI to actually try doing stuff and learn from its mistakes.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And that's where the big problem is. These mistakes that agentic AI is going to make in the real world in the process of learning to do it better are going to be really costly. Things like booking a flight ticket to the wrong destination. And so it's going to take, I think, quite a long time to have this feedback loop of getting it to work a little bit better so that you can deploy it a little bit more, getting more experience. And that's exactly what we've seen with self-driving cars. We had prototypes 20, 30 years ago, but to gradually improve its performance to the point where you can rely on it and thereby collect more driving miles of experience has taken way, way longer than people expected.
Mm-hmm. Although we're kind of getting there, at least in the sense of like the Waymo model, where if you confine it to one city, it can do a good job.
Yes, and totally. Yeah, and it's very impressive. And the latest crash statistics from Waymo show that it's safer than human drivers. Very much something to be celebrated. But my point is, it took 20, 30 years to get there.
Yeah. Okay. So now there are different kinds of agentic AI. One thing that I'm told is now kind of doable is that you can say, well, I want a website that looks like this and this and this and this, and it will generate the code that will give you that website. That would be impressive if true. I gather it's true.
That already works. I mean, I'm building, little apps for so for example, I have two little kids. I built them a little app to learn phonics. It's not that I'm outsourcing that to AI. I'm there with them, helping them learn phonics. But, I think the app helps a little bit here. And it's the kind of thing that would probably have taken a week of effort in the past. So I wouldn't have done it. I would have tried to look for something off the shelf. But here I was able to use AI to build exactly the thing that I wanted within a few hours. And it's totally remarkable. But here's the difference, right? So for me, I was able to build this toy app, and there's lots of people building. If you have a restaurant, you want to stand up a website, certainly you can use AI to do that. But imagine something more serious. Let's say an airline wants to build a website to, do all the things that flyers want to do on the website. That's like tens of thousands of lines of code. And to be able to have to interact with that body of code by talking to AI instead of being able to directly edit the code, at that point, AI is probably slowing you down more than speeding you up. So that's the reason why we shouldn't get too excited about this. It's one reason, or it's one thing to be able to build a toy app or a toy website. It's another thing to be able to automate the work of, a serious 100-person team at a company that might be building an enterprise website or application.
Mm-hmm. And I gather one thing that corporations either are starting to do or will start to do is actually monitor what their employees are doing so closely that can become the data for the machine learning is that right?
That's that's a possibility. I mean, there are lots of reasons why it might not happen. Obviously, there are concerns about surveillance and so forth. And it might also just turn out that even with all that monitoring, it's not that helpful for building AI to automate lots of actual real world jobs. We just don't know yet. But certainly companies are trying to do this.
Okay. So I have one generic question about generative, about large language models in particular, before we turn to some of your concerns about predictive AI. So, one view of large language models, especially when it first hit, GPT 3.5 first hit, and then 4 and got all this attention. And this was especially common in the AI ethics community, I think, was to kind of minimize their power by referring to them as, fancy autocomplete, stochastic parrots. And then at the other end of that spectrum of being impressed is that, well, no, although they are trained to learn to just complete sentences, it turns out that to do a good job of this, they actually have to build, kind of internal structures that in some ways are functionally comparable to what's going on in the human mind. It's actually pretty damn impressive. You can't even paraphrase well if you don't have some way of representing the meaning of words, for example, and so on. Where are you on this spectrum?
I mean, language models clearly have these internal structures. A purely statistical text generator, we know what that looks like. It's called a Markov model. We've had those for, I don't know, 50 years, and they don't produce coherent text. And also, we can look inside language models. This whole black box thing is way oversold. They're not black boxes in the way that people often think they are. It's just that we have to put in the effort to interrogate what's going on inside, and people have done that, and there are clearly internal structures. But at the same time, there's also a lot of evidence that those structures are not necessarily the same kinds of things we have in our minds, and it works for the typical kind of text that language models encounter. But if they are provided a question that is called out of distribution, is the technical term, then those structures that they've built up quickly break down and don't generalize in the flexible way that human minds can. So a great example of this is there's this puzzle that people may have heard. There's a person, a wolf, a goat, and a cabbage, something like that. And there's a boat you have to cross with all of these. There's a river, and if you leave the wolf alone with the wolf will eat the goat, etc. Right? This kind of puzzle. So these language models have seen many examples of this kind of puzzle online. So if you give them this puzzle, they're very good at doing it. But instead, if you say there's a person, a wolf, and a cabbage, right? You leave out the goat and you ask them what to do, they will invent a goat because they have seen this puzzle with a goat so many times that they're unable to quote unquote reason instead of just parrot what they have seen. So there is an element of structure, there is an element of parrotry, and it's a nuanced line. And I think both extremes are oversimplified.
Okay. I think, well, one thing that I just heard about recently that kind of impressed me. So they built this thing, I guess, a couple of years ago that was designed specifically to predict how Amazon book reviews would kind of be completed or something by showing at the beginning of them. And then they, again, as you say, they do get around to understanding some of these things. There's just sometimes a lag between the models unveiling and totally understanding it. And they discovered that there was something in it that you could call an emotion detector. Like there was a pattern of activation that, and that's just fascinating. Because first of all, we have emotion detectors. We may not think about it, but we do gauge the emotions of what people are saying to us, on the basis of facial cues as well as linguistic ones. But, and so that would be a case where I think it was inventing something functionally comparable to part of the human mind, right?
Yes, there is very strong evidence for this kind of thing, and this is the fundamental basis of how large language models are able to do useful things. So what they're trained for is simply to predict the next word in a sequence of words, and all of these other things that they learn to do. Let's say produce grammatically correct sentences, or translate text from one language to another, or in your case, detect the sentiment of text. All of these things just emerge as a byproduct of being really good at predicting words in a sequence, because the most efficient way to predict words in a sequence is to build up these structures, and yeah, like you said, in many cases they match really well with the ones in our minds, but often they don't. And it's those 1% of cases where there is some catastrophic failure of the model to generalize that leads to the fact that these are very unreliable when you put them in software products, and we can't
Mhm.
really trust them.
Yeah. Okay. So on this predictive AI thing, now you've been on this case quite a while, I think, doing research on how well it does or doesn't work, what the implications are, what the good and bad social consequences can be. What are some of the things you most want to draw attention to here?
Yeah, that's right. So I've been looking into this for 5+ years. And so here we're talking about a different kind of AI that is used to predict, for instance, which job candidate will do well at a job if they're hired in the criminal justice system, in the medical system, in many, many other areas. And really, I mean, just the one fundamental thing to keep in mind here is that how well predictive AI can work as opposed to generative AI has very little to do with how big was the data set it was trained on, how big the model is, how many parameters it has, none of that mumbo jumbo. It's just a consequence of the fact that the future is not determined yet.
Mhm.
And you just can't predict something that isn't known beyond, finding crude statistical associations, right? So people who scored well in a particular test might do slightly better at a particular job, but that's, we're talking about like a 10% difference, right? So that's really the most you can do. And when people forget that and treat these as oracles and put more weight into the predictions of these AI tools than they should, then they often end up making decisions that are, first of all, inaccurate and also unjust in many ways. So you're determining people's life chances without giving them a way to challenge that decision. So those are two of the many problematic things about predictive AI.
Mhm. Um, and now I would assume in some cases, you point out why certain kinds of predictive models are so bad. Data leakage is an example, and we can talk about that. But I would think that over time, as people like you point out what the deficiencies are, these things would get better. Have they not? Have they gotten somewhat better? Is there some rate of improvement?
It's hard to tell because the companies building these models are extremely non transparent. And a big reason is that if they were transparent about how poorly things work, they would lose a lot of their customers. And so a lot of the evidence that we have is from academic research that has either tried to audit these tools from the outside or build our own models and see how well they can work. And let me give you one example. There's this thing called the Fragile Families Challenge that was led by Professor Matt Salgonik, who's one of my Princeton colleagues, and several other researchers here. And it was what they call a mass collaboration. So there were teams of machine learning researchers, I think around 160 teams, all trying to see how well one can predict the life outcomes of disadvantaged kids. So these are around 4,000 families, low income and underprivileged in some way for the most part. And they had lots of data about these families, about 13,000 variables per family. So there were, detailed survey questions about so many different aspects of the kid's life and the parent's life and so forth. So they wanted to see, given all this data, can you predict the kid's GPA at school? Can you predict which parents are at risk of job loss and so forth? And what they found at the conclusion of this multi-year endeavor was that you can only do like a few percent better than random,
Hmm.
even with this data set that's pretty large by social science standards and with all of the best classifiers or algorithms that people were able to throw at it.
Hmm.
And it was no better than the simplest regression model you can build using century old statistical techniques and using only four variables about each child, the mother's race, income, and a few things like that. There was a slight improvement from using more sophisticated techniques, but it was not really a meaningful one. So when I
Yeah.
look at evidence like that, I don't know. It just feels like you're running up against limits that nature is throwing at you, and better algorithms are not really helping that much.
Yeah. That's interesting. And in a way, surprising, I guess. And maybe one thing we should say is that these very, generative and predictive, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but a thing they have in common is, okay, they're both machine learning, right? And in both cases,
That's right.
like you've got a lot of input data and output data. Like you've got some pre-existing on data on these families or these students and what some variables were, and then what the outcomes were, what the GPA was or something. And you feed the stuff in, and over time, the machine, through trial and error and some other stuff, gets better at. It's supposed to get better predicting. And with a large language model, the input could be the beginning of a sentence, and then the output is like the next word, and the machine over time gets better predicting that. And in both cases, they are in principle learning, variables that are predictive. And you would think that machine learning, with all this power, if you can throw in all of this stuff, you would think it would uncover, variables that have escaped human attention or something, right? I mean, it's a reasonable expectation that this would be amazingly powerful, right?
Yes. Yeah. And, to some extent, I hold that expectation. So, for instance, Matt, who I just mentioned, and many of our Princeton colleagues are trying to see what happens when you go from thousands of families to a scale of millions of families and actually use large language models to try to learn those patterns. And I do expect that they'll be able to do better than they did in the Fragile Families Challenge. But I think that's still not going to be enough to get the accuracy level to a point where it just becomes morally justifiable to, deny someone bail, for instance, right?
Mhm.
On the basis of saying that we're so confident you're going to commit another crime that we're going to we're going to act as if you have already committed another crime. So that sort of thing, I think, is very problematic.
Although I assume that's a case where judges are already using their own little algorithms, right? Which probably aren't super reliable to begin with, and may, in addition, reflect the particular prejudices of the judge.
They certainly are, and in fact, that's one reason why these algorithmic tools have found so much uptake in the criminal justice system. And my view is that neither of these should be used. I think, first of all, in many cases, we can make systemic reforms, and there's been a huge amount of effort on how do you reform this bail process, and what cases do you even need a money bail? Are there other methods like ankle monitors, and those other approaches have their supporters and detractors. But also, if you are going to have these criteria, I think those should be simple formulas that even the defendants can keep in their mind and understand. It's like, okay, here's your third strike, so now you're going to be treated, more harshly than you were the first two times. And I think that sort of thing, as opposed to a black box, whether it's the black box in the mind of a judge or it's the black box of an algorithm that is administered by some unaccountable company, something that's transparent to everybody has a huge number of advantages. The most important one being that when people understand the rule, they can modify their behavior, and the rule now serves as an incentive to improve their behavior.
Mhm.
Instead of that, if it's a black box, then you never know what's going to happen when you're arrested. So it doesn't actually incentivize you to improve your behavior.
Yeah. And of course, I mean, as far as bail goes, the idea that whether you stay in jail depends on how much money you have is a questionable ethical principle to
Right.
begin with.
Right.
Um, so what are there other areas where you would say, okay, you're going to need to make predictions, and any improvement on the confidence we now have is good? And so when I'm thinking like healthcare or something, maybe not necessarily insurance coverage, but something where, applying different kinds of treatment could increase the number of people who survive or something. Like, what's an example? I mean, is there some place where this stuff has made the world better?
Of course, of course. I mean, health insurance is more morally complicated, but if you look at auto insurance, right, whether my premium should be $200 a month or $500 a month, that is fundamentally a risk-based decision. And if insurers didn't use risk-based pricing, they would go out of business. And so there's no question that you have to use some kind of statistical system here. Whether you call it AI or not, that's a different question. But yeah, I don't dispute that predictive methods are necessary in some cases. There need to be guardrails, et cetera. But I'm not saying we should always get rid of them. And there are even, a more kind of newer applications that do have some morally dubious consequences where I would nonetheless support their use. One example being Meta on Facebook and Instagram uses AI to determine which posters might be at risk of self harm. And just a warning for folks is a discussion of that topic. Who might be at risk of suicide based on what they have posted, and if so, try to intervene. Now,
Hmm.
this is again a kind of double-edged. Obviously, it can potentially save lives. We don't know how many lives they have intervened on, saved in this way because they're not very transparent with the statistics of it. And it can also go wrong. You can have a false alarm and an interaction between a police officer who is sent to intervene and a mentally unstable person can go really wrong. And there are some statistics on the fact that encounters with the police are much more likely to turn deadly when the person is mentally unstable. So, this is pretty devilish. And in spite of that, I would ultimately support applications like this if there are proper guardrails and transparency, which there are not currently. Right. So, on the one hand, you have relatively uncontroversial applications like car insurance, and then you have more controversial, but nonetheless justifiable applications like this suicide prediction thing. And then you have criminal risk prediction, where I would very much be in support of getting rid of it.
Hmm. And there are cases where, I mean, you can make a case for wanting some predictive power, and there is predictive power, but there are correlations with things like ethnicity that may be kind of, socially undesirable or something. I mean, you can go all the way back to redlining, right? Remember when, loan, savings and loan companies would just say, okay, anybody who lives over here, we're just not gonna make them a loan. I think that became illegal. I assume it had some predictive power, but one of the problems with it, in addition to the sheer fatalism of it, like if you live in this neighborhood, there's no hope. That's just kind of a bad message to send. But in addition to that, there were correlations with ethnicity and so on. And that's an algorithm. It had predictive power, right? But anyway, that basic ethical dilemma persists, right? With much more refined algorithms that I presume have somewhat more predictive power now.
That's exactly right, and I think that's a good analogy. And while the people who practiced redlining were no doubt motivated by, to some degree, at least some of them, by racial animus, it's also true that they were able to justify their decisions purely in terms of risk by claiming that these areas were more risky and that it was therefore an economically irrational decision. And a lot of the justifications for the use of algorithms today are along similar lines. And in some cases, it's just very clear that the decision maker should change the algorithm to improve equity. But in other cases, it might be genuinely, a hard line to draw, whether you're using algorithms or some other process to make this decision.
Okay. Now I said we'd explain data leakage, and I don't think we have, but it's the whole question of specific identifiable ways that these things go wrong is interesting and important, and this is one kind of thing that can make these things turn out to be faulty. You want to explain what that is?
Sure. Yeah. So far, we've been talking about over promises of AI, where the company often, makes a claim that's not supported by the evidence. In some way, they're trying to fool the public or customers. But data leakage is a kind of thing where it's often companies or more often researchers who are fooling themselves into thinking that the AI works much better than it actually does. So a good example is Epic, a healthcare company, released an algorithmic product, AI product, for hospitals to detect when someone is in danger of sepsis. And this was a machine learning system. It had ingested a lot of signals from previous patients to try to identify the patterns. What is it that causes someone to be at high risk of developing sepsis in a hospital? And it's important to predict this because sepsis is often deadly and early intervention can really save lives. And they claimed it had a certain accuracy level. I believe it was 76 to 83%. But then, after it had been deployed in hundreds of hospitals 4 years later, when independent researchers did an evaluation, they found an accuracy that was much lower. It was like 63%. And
And
50%
50%
is random.
is yeah, 50% is no good at all. You could
That's right.
and
That's
so
right.
63% is slightly better, but not
Slightly
nearly
better
what
than
they
random.
claim.
Yeah, that's right. And in fact, the numbers don't even tell the whole story. It turned out that it was just overwhelming physicians with false alerts and still missing two-thirds of the sepsis cases. And so when this came out, in fact, it was so bad for Epic that they stopped selling this one-size-fits-all tool and told each hospital to kind of tailor it to their own patient population, which was a much better way to go. But the reason that this has happened, the reason that Epic wasn't even aware of it, was that the way they had built and evaluated this tool, one of the features that was being used for prediction was whether antibiotics had been prescribed for treating sepsis, right? So, in other words, if the physician has already diagnosed sepsis, then the prediction is coming too late to, in fact, make a
Right.
difference. And you might say, how crazy is it that they missed this very basic thing? But it's actually not that hard to imagine when the system is getting data from hundreds of different hospitals and all of these variables are coded in different ways. It's hard for the developer to go in and examine each of those thousands of different variables and try to understand if those are supposed to be used for prediction or not. But it's very easy to just throw everything into an AI system and just, make it figure out the patterns. But it might just turn out that some of those patterns um, are wrong and should not be used when the tool is, or cannot be used when the tool is actually put into production. And so you might have these flaws that are hiding and you never notice them. So that's an example of leakage. Leakage is when data that sorry, it's a very technical definition. I'm trying
Yeah, I
to
was going to
figure
ask
out.
how exactly the term came to be applied, but go ahead, take a shot
Yeah.
at it.
Uh, yeah. So the reason this is called leakage is because when you're evaluating AI, you have something called the training data and you have the testing data. And the way you make sure that AI is going to do well in the real world when you put it in an environment that it hasn't encountered before is to simulate that situation, right? Where you have some test data that comes from patients, for instance, that it has never encountered before. But
Mhm.
leakage is when some of the test data actually gets into your training data. In other words, it has already seen the answers to the test. And so you're going to conclude that it's doing really well. But then when you put it out there in the world, it's going to fail badly.
Okay. And what was the case in the book where they were, it was like patients with asthma who, in this case, are obviously at high risk, were actually being sent home from the hospital or something on the basis. There's some irony here that I forget exactly, but well,
Yeah, this was fortunately a case where they caught it before anything was put into an actual clinical system. This was a research paper. Rich Caruana was the lead researcher. What they found is that this was an algorithm that was being used for triage, I believe. So when a patient came into a hospital, if they if they have pneumonia, are they at high risk of complications from pneumonia?
mhm.
And what the machine learning system learned is that if they have asthma, they're at lower risk of complications from pneumonia. So the funny thing, though, was that this was a true pattern in the data. The reason it was a true pattern in the data was because in the existing hospital system, if someone came in with asthma, they're more likely to be sent to the ICU where they get intervention that actually decreases their risk of complications.
So
And, the model.
it's because the importance of the variable had already come to the attention of people
That's
that
right.
the machine learning was overemphasizing it or
That's right.
misconstruing its significance.
That's right. And the ironic thing is that the model was meant to replace the human triage system. And if they had actually done so, it would have had very bad consequences. So, there are many ways in which oversight of these machine learning systems is required. And sometimes we don't even know until bad things happen that a certain type of oversight was required. So we might know, for instance, that someone should monitor the individual decisions, but if they were just monitoring the individual decisions, they would not know that it had internalized this incorrect pattern. And so that's a different kind of guardrail, a different kind of oversight.
Is it the case that, like, when they're about to train a model and they've decided which variables are going to feed into it, if they showed the variables to some extremely astute person who kind of knew statistics, but also knew the territory, like, they would be able to say, no, this one and this one and this one are a bad idea? Or is that just really hard? I mean, or in principle, could you even have an AI do that job? But leave that aside for now. Could a human do a good job of it?
In theory, yes. In practice, I think there are a couple of difficulties. One, there might simply be too many variables. And the other is you might not have great information about exactly how some variable was collected, right, during the data collection process. That might have been a really messy process. It might have gone through several organizations. The data may have changed hands a lot. And so you often just don't have a lot of information about the quality of your data.
Okay. So you talk about social media in the book, a subject of interest to lots of people these days, given the plausible reason to believe it's done a certain amount of damage to our society and politics. Now for starters, you don't put a lot of hope in content moderation. Am I right about that?
I think content moderation is good for certain things.
Maybe we should identify the problem. What is it that you think is most pernicious as things stand about social media and their algorithms?
There are many things that people are concerned about when it comes to social media. Addiction, mental health, especially for teen girls, polarization, enabling violence in some cases. I think when people say, is the social media's fault? I think the answer really depends on what one means by that. People often try to say, are we in a worse world now than if social media had not existed? And that's very hard to answer. If it wasn't social media, I think a lot of these bad outcomes would be happening, perhaps due to other ways in which people interact with each other. But I think what is definitely true is that the companies running these platforms could be doing a better job of curbing some of these problems. And that's where content moderation comes in, right? It's the idea of having a policy for what can stay on the app and what can't, and enforcing that policy. And the big challenge with content moderation is that you have to balance free expression and curbing a lot of these harms. And I think it's a genuine challenge. I think there's no clear line that everybody is going to agree on. And so that's one reason why AI is very tempting, right? So instead of bickering about these different groups of stakeholders wanting different things from the system, we'll just leave it to AI. It's going to be an objective judge of where the line should be. Mm-hmm. And I think that's just a completely faulty premise. I think that's not going to solve anything. I think social media companies already have a crisis of legitimacy because they are the arbiters of what can be said online, and they are, unelected, unaccountable arbiters of the public square. It's not a position they asked for, right? When these app developers started building the first social networks, they did not imagine that they were going to be in this position. But now that they are in this position, the fact that they're making these decisions without very much oversight, I think everybody is unhappy with what's on these platforms. So some people are unhappy that free expression is being curbed too much, and other people are unhappy that there is too much harassment and vile content on these platforms. And so they're in a difficult position. And I think adding AI to the mix is only going to further weaken their legitimacy, because a lot of people don't trust AI, and ultimately the AI can only be as trustworthy as the actor that is wielding it. And so I don't think it's going to solve that problem at all.
Are you talking about AI used in content moderation? Because they are using AI in the algorithm itself, but that's what you're talking about?
That's right. So AI being used to decide which posts to take down and which ones to leave up.
Um, one thing I think I learned, if I understood correctly from the book, is that these community notes that Twitter has experimented with, I gather they are given more prominence if they are being boosted or getting, thumbs ups from kind of both sides of some tribal divide or something of political, which it tells me, for starters, that they do have ways of identifying generally antagonistic groups, it sounds like, right? Like they know, like this group and this group, well, either have a very low correlation of agreement on what is good content. Maybe that's the definition of what they're doing, right? Just low correlation of agreement. Or do they have a way of gauging active antagonism between the groups?
Yeah, I mean, from a computer science perspective, the beautiful thing about this is that it's the first thing. It's just based on the correlation matrix. The identity of these two groups kind of falls out, and it's generally believed that it aligns with our political axis, but no one has looked inside the AI, if you will, and really tried to identify if the two antagonistic groups that the model has identified is, the groups that we're familiar with. But there's a lot of evidence that it's roughly the same. Um, and yes, I think this notion of bridging, which is what it's called, that community notes are visible when people from different sides of the divide can agree on it. I think that's wonderful. That's exactly the kind of thing that's necessary for the health of social media. And when I said earlier that companies aren't doing enough, this is exactly the kind of thing they should be doing more of. I'm a fan of community notes. I think it should be much more widely deployed, and it should be deployed not just at the level of notes that you attach to posts, but also at the level of the recommendation algorithm that surfaces these posts in people's feeds in the first place.
Mhm.
So I think posts that have agreements from across different parts of the divide should get more visibility.
Okay, so these are, it sounds like they are now doing that, like with the community notes, but one can also imagine doing it more broadly within the algorithm, right? Just
That's right. That's right.
promoting content that the two generally antagonistic tribes both seem to like, and demoting, giving less momentum to content that is exclusively, more or less exclusively liked by one tribe or the other. They could do that, but they're not. And look, I'm not. It sounds like the consequences of that would not be easy to predict and could be complicated, but it sounds like they're not even trying that.
I have not seen any, pilot of that kind of system even. And I think that's unfortunate. And I hope that at least some of the smaller networks will try it. And I can see why the larger ones are not. I think there are definitely going to be people unhappy with that. In some sense, by doing that, they would be expressing a political stance that more centrist content is better than ideologically aligned content. So that itself is a political stance that they might be unhappy with expressing. They might want to, kind of stay neutral on that. But I think the consequences of the way social media is now are such that I would much prefer for companies to bite that bullet, acknowledge that they're arbiters of content anyway, and be comfortable with expressing a stance and what they think is better for the public square and for humanity.
I mean, it might not always be centrist per se. In other words, there are things that, like, Trumpists and the fairly far left agree on. There's a populist element to both, maybe having to do with economic policy, maybe having to do with foreign policy. There's a very strong non-interventionist strand in both, and but neither of those kinds of policies is generally thought of as in the middle of the political spectrum, right? I mean, that's what I mean when I say it's hard for me to imagine exactly what the consequences would be, but I don't think it would be quite as simple as you know, choosing a centrist position in every case.
Oh, definitely agree with that. It would be hard to predict, but whatever it is that ends up happening, in a sense, it's because the platform put its thumb on the scales, right? And that's what the companies are worried of. They don't want to be accused of doing that. So whatever content gets promoted as a result of this, some other content is going to get demoted, and the people who stand to lose from that are going to accuse the companies of taking a side here, and they don't want that. But I wish they would, yeah, they would be bolder.
Well, also, aren't they in a stronger position to defend what they're doing than they are when they do something they have done, which is that, say, people in the administration, the current presidential administration, contact them and say, we think this is misinformation. And they have very often paid attention to that guidance in the past, maybe not so much Elon Musk, at least not with this administration. But that's cases where human beings are looking at and are aware of its ideological location and saying, yeah, we're getting rid of it. They could at least say, look, here's the algorithm. Here's the way it works. It's all about correlation. And sometimes it works to the benefit of this, I almost think, there are cases where I think we'd be better off just saying, look, we turned it over to the AI. Don't blame us, right?
Well, I definitely agree that there are genuine concerns about what should be what is and is not a permissible level of interaction between governments and companies when it comes to content moderation. Um, I, I'm less optimistic than you that turning it over to the AI is going to solve any problem. I think it's great to have a standardized process and a published policy and to stick to that policy and for that policy to be transparent. But I'm not sure automation is really the answer.
Yeah. I mean, I'm thinking, like I'm old enough to remember a totally different information ecosystem, three networks, three TV networks, and so on. There was a certain amount of inherent centralization that, had a homogenizing effect on opinion and had a marginalizing effect on very small constituencies unless they had ways of being very powerful. And that has obvious downsides, but the country wasn't on the verge of civil war. That was kind of nice. So, I'm just saying, in principle, algorithms could simulate some features of a different, technological, media infrastructure.
Yep, yep, that's a fair assessment.
Okay, so now, as you know, we've been talking close to an hour. We're going to talk a little more. And the way we generally do this is the overtime session is available to Nonzero members, also known as paid subscribers. It's easy to become one. We encourage it. I should also say we encourage you to subscribe to the AI Snake Oil newsletter. I'm a subscriber. I enjoy it, get a lot out of it. And then there's your book, which people should also buy. It's very convenient that they have the same name. There's so little that we're asking people to remember here. Just 3 words, AI Snake Oil. You've been kind enough to say, yeah, you'll stick around for some more discussion. I want to get more into generative AI. I'm more concerned about, I'm not a full-on doomer, but I'm more concerned than you are. And so I want to talk about some of that. But before we cross this bridge into overtime, I want to give you a chance to say anything else about the book. Things maybe we haven't emphasized enough. Again, there is this whole discussion of generative AI, large language models, some good historical summary, like how we got here, and your own assessment of the risks and why certain things, like you think the risk of rogue AIs is overstated. I want to talk about that in overtime. But what else would you say about the book?
There's a lot we talk about in the book that isn't even about AI, but we think is important to understand the role that AI has and will have in our societies. So we have a whole chapter, for instance, on why the future is so hard to predict, and we get into a lot of the social science research on why the success of books, for instance. We thought about this a lot when writing our own book, why it's just so fundamentally unpredictable, why chance events have such a big impact on the course of history as well as the course of individual people's lives. And I drew from a lot of my own personal experiences and the roles that chance has played in me being where I am here today instead of somewhere much more obscure. And I think it's important to keep that broader context in mind. It's because we often forget those things that this idea of a predictable future seems so plausible when in fact, when we're grounded in what the research shows, I think we should be much more skeptical about that. We also talk about the role of regulation. We kind of have a middle ground approach. There are definitely ways in which regulation can go wrong, but also we don't subscribe to, a full speed ahead mentality. So, yeah, many parts of the book that aren't really about AI, but could be interesting to readers.
Okay, so I encourage people to get it. It's just coming out now. AI Snake Oil: What Artificial Intelligence Can Do, What It Can't, and How to Tell the Difference. Thanks everybody who stayed with us this far. Encourage you to stay with us. But in any event, thank you, and we will see you down the road.